For most people across the Sahel, the past 48 hours felt like the moment when the ground itself shifted beneath their feet. It began quietly, almost like the distant rumble before a storm. Radios crackled to life in the early morning, phones buzzed with alerts, and families who were preparing for another day of work suddenly found themselves listening to a message unlike anything they had heard before. More than 6 African nations, some of which had barely agreed on matters of policy in the past, had come together to issue a single, powerful declaration. In a small village in Mali, an elderly man named Issa stood outside his home at dawn, the cool air brushing against his face as he held his radio close to his ear. The announcer's voice trembled slightly as he repeated the headline. 6 countries had spoken with one voice, and what they said was sending shockwaves through governments around the world. Issa had survived droughts, coups, and border conflicts, yet something about the tone of this announcement made him pause. He sensed that this was not simply another political statement. It was a turning point. Across Burkina Faso, Niger, Guinea, Togo, and beyond, similar scenes unfolded. Markets went silent as people gathered around televisions. Military patrols tightened their routes. Community leaders whispered among themselves, trying to understand what could have driven so many nations to unite so suddenly and so forcefully. For decades, Africa's political landscape had been shaped by outside influence, shifting alliances, and silent battles for resources. But this declaration felt different. It felt intentional. It felt historic. It felt like the beginning of something that could reshape the entire region. If moments like this make you stop and reflect on how quickly global stability can shift, stay with us. Understanding why these nations chose this exact moment to raise their voices may reveal more than a regional concern. It may reveal the early signs of a geopolitical transformation already underway. Because behind the carefully chosen words of this announcement lies a deeper truth, one that could challenge decades of international policy. And as we look closer at what happened in these past 48 hours, a question rises to the surface with unsettling clarity. What did these nations see or discover that compelled them to speak together for the first time in years? The shift began quietly 2 days ago, when senior officials from 6 African nations, including Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Guinea, Togo, and one East African country that has chosen to remain unnamed for the moment, completed a series of urgent private consultations. By sunrise, these governments released a joint declaration that immediately captured the attention of millions across the continent. The text was brief but forceful. It stated that these nations would no longer accept what they described as coordinated external interference, covert destabilization efforts, and political pressure aimed at weakening African sovereignty. What made the announcement extraordinary was not only the strength of the language, but the unity behind it. Several of these countries had previously struggled to agree on even minor diplomatic matters, yet now they were speaking as a single voice. The declaration also warned that any foreign military presence not explicitly invited would be regarded as a national security threat, and that existing security arrangements with outside powers would be reviewed without delay. Observers across Africa were quick to point out that nothing like this had occurred in decades. Inside Burkina Faso, officials quietly acknowledged that the statement was connected to intelligence reports detailing unusual activity near the tri-border region, with Mali and Niger. These reports suggested that multiple foreign-linked actors had been involved in supporting groups operating along remote corridors. While the governments did not publicly release details, the timing of the declaration left little doubt that something significant had pushed them to act together. In Mali, a retired officer speaking anonymously described the moment he heard the announcement on state radio. He said it felt like the region had reached a point of no return, a moment when nations decided they would no longer stand by while outside players shaped their future without consent. At the same time, civilians across the Sahel experienced their own shock. In a small community outside Bamako, a farmer named Ibrahim recounted how he first heard the news on his neighbor's battery-powered radio. He had finished tending to his animals when the announcer repeated the headline several times, his voice unusually tense. Ibrahim said that for a moment he simply stood still, unable to move, because he felt something historic had just begun. He had lived his entire life hearing stories of outside powers influencing African politics, yet he had never heard so many governments speak in unison about ending it. His reaction reflected the sentiments of many who have long believed their countries were operating under distant influences that never fully revealed themselves. Markets across the region reacted with a mix of anxiety and quiet hope. Some traders worried that the strong wording of the declaration could provoke retaliation from powerful foreign governments. Others felt encouraged and said the moment symbolized a shift in Africa's political identity, a move towards standing up against long-established patterns of dependency. In Niger, a shop owner named Fatima told a reporter that she was afraid of what might come next, but also proud that her country had taken a stand alongside its neighbors. Her comment captured the conflicting emotions of a population caught between fear and hope. If moments like this make you think about how fragile stability can be, especially in regions shaped by generations of outside influence, it may be worth staying with this story. Understanding why these nations chose to act now can reveal much about the pressures that have been quietly building beneath the surface. Behind the scenes, intelligence analysts noted that the declaration was not merely symbolic. Reports showed an unusual increase in encrypted communications detected near several border areas during the previous week. Additional satellite imagery revealed small convoys of unidentified vehicles moving at night through routes normally used by smugglers or insurgent groups. Although no government officially linked these developments to the joint statement, the timing raised questions too significant to ignore. As these details emerged, the world began to realize that this declaration was not a typical diplomatic gesture. It was a response to something urgent, something coordinated, and possibly something hidden from the public view. And as the international community reacted with surprise and confusion, one unsettling question grew louder. What exactly did these 6 nations see in the past 48 hours that compelled them to raise their voices together for the first time in many years? As the joint declaration spread across Africa and reached newsrooms around the world, the crisis entered its most intense and revealing phase. In Ouagadougou, the government of Burkina Faso held an emergency late-night meeting inside the National Security Center, where advisors reviewed classified reports that had arrived over the previous 2 days. The atmosphere was tense, and senior officials spoke in low voices as they assessed the implications of the coordinated statement. One advisor later described the moment by saying that it felt as if a curtain had finally been pulled back on forces operating behind the scenes. Inside the room, leaders agreed that the declaration was not only a message of unity, but also a warning that the region would no longer allow unexplained activities to go unanswered. In the capital's streets, people gathered around televisions in small cafes and in crowded markets to hear the government's response. Many felt both anxious and proud, sensing that their country had taken part in something that could reshape the balance of power in the Sahel. In neighboring Niger and Mali, the reaction was even more intense. Crowds filled public squares, waving flags and chanting messages of support for regional sovereignty. Elderly citizens who had lived through multiple transitions in government said they had never seen such a moment of solidarity. For years, these countries had faced violence, political turmoil, and pressure from outside actors. Yet the unity displayed in the declaration made many feel that Africa was beginning to write its own narrative. A shopkeeper in Niamey named Burema recalled how he and his wife stood silently in their living room as they listened to the announcement on television. He said that his wife cried quietly, telling him that she had waited her entire life to hear African nations speak this boldly. Her reaction captured the emotional weight of the moment. At the same time, the world reacted with speed and division. Some nations expressed concern about the direction the Sahel was taking, while others warned that the declaration signaled a shift toward greater geopolitical confrontation. In Washington, analysts from multiple agencies worked through the night, trying to evaluate the intelligence behind the announcement. Senior officials feared that the statement could be a sign of deeper instability brewing in the region. In European capitals, leaders issued cautious remarks, calling for calm, but also hinting that the sudden unity of these 6 nations could complicate long-standing agreements. Meanwhile, in Moscow and Beijing, statements praised the declaration as a sign of African independence and a rejection of long-standing patterns of external influence. The contrasting responses underscored how deeply the Sahel is intertwined with global politics. While leaders debated, ordinary citizens across the region continued to live with uncertainty. Schools in several towns closed temporarily. Medical clinics operated with limited supplies. Food prices rose sharply in border communities. A teacher in Guinea named Salifu said that his students asked whether the world was preparing for conflict. He tried to reassure them, but he admitted privately that he did not know what the next week would bring. His concern reflected the fears of millions who had endured years of instability and now wondered whether this moment of unity would bring safety or more tension. If hearing these stories makes you reflect on how quickly the lives of everyday families can be shaped by decisions made far above them, this is a moment worth paying attention to. Understanding the emotional and political reactions unfolding across Africa helps reveal the stakes of this crisis and the limits of what these nations are willing to accept. Yet the most significant development came 48 hours after the declaration, when leaked information began circulating among journalists and analysts. According to these reports, the 6 nations had acted after receiving intelligence that pointed to a network of external actors attempting to influence military and political outcomes across the Sahel. Although officials refused to confirm or deny the details, the leak intensified speculation and raised the question that everyone was now asking: what exactly pushed these nations to speak together with such urgency? And what will happen if the forces behind the scenes decide to push back? As the joint declaration continued to echo across Africa, its consequences began to unfold in complex and deeply personal ways. Civilians in the Sahel, long accustomed to living under the shadow of uncertainty, felt a shift that was both hopeful and unsettling. In some towns, daily routines changed almost overnight. Markets once crowded with vendors grew quieter as food prices rose sharply due to tightened borders and disrupted supply routes. Families who relied on cross-border trade suddenly found themselves struggling to purchase basic goods. In the northern region of Burkina Faso, a mother named Mariama described how she walked 6 miles to find medicine for her youngest child, only to discover that the local clinic had run out of essential supplies. She said she did not fear the political consequences as much as she feared the slow erosion of ordinary life. Her story reflects the quiet burdens carried by countless families as the Sahel adjusts to a new and unpredictable reality. At the same time, schools in several regions temporarily closed because local authorities were uncertain about the safety of teachers and students. A headmaster in Niger explained that he gathered his staff for an emergency meeting to decide whether classes could continue. With a heavy heart, he chose to suspend operations until the situation became clearer. He later said that the sound of children's voices had always brought life to the schoolyard, and the sudden silence felt like a weight pressing on his soul. For older citizens who have lived through decades of political turbulence, the current moment feels familiar, but different. Many sense that this is no longer merely a local struggle, but part of a much larger contest over the future of the continent. Politically, the declaration triggered a wave of realignments. Some governments in the region expressed interest in joining the coalition of nations seeking to assert greater sovereignty. Behind closed doors, several countries began reviewing their security partnerships, a move that surprised diplomats in Western capitals. Opposition parties within the Sahel also felt the shock. Some leaders accused their governments of provoking powerful international actors, warning that the region could be drawn into deeper conflict. Others celebrated what they described as a long overdue shift toward African self-determination. In Guinea, a professor of political science explained during a radio interview that the declaration might mark the beginning of a new phase in African politics, one in which nations prioritize unity over dependency. His remarks captured the growing sense that the political landscape is changing in ways that cannot easily be reversed. Military movements also contributed to the tension. Reports from Mali and Niger indicated that border patrols had been strengthened, and several checkpoints that were previously unmanned now operated around the clock. Although officials insisted the measures were precautionary, civilians interpreted the increased presence as a sign that regional leaders were preparing for the possibility of backlash. Some residents welcomed the additional security, while others felt uneasy, wondering whether this buildup suggested that something larger was approaching. In Togo, fishermen along the coast noticed unusual naval activity further out at sea, and rumors circulated that foreign vessels might be monitoring the region more closely. If you find yourself reflecting on how deeply global politics can influence the day-to-day lives of ordinary people, it may be helpful to remember that moments like this are rarely isolated. They are part of a broader pattern in which nations struggle to protect their sovereignty, while everyday families are left to navigate the consequences. Understanding the civil and political impact of this declaration helps explain why so many Africans feel both pride and fear at the same time. Despite the uncertainty, there is also a rising sense of unity. Community leaders across the Sahel have organized meetings encouraging cooperation and resilience. Religious leaders have urged people to stay calm, reminding them that faith and patience can carry communities through even the most turbulent times. For many older citizens, these gestures echo past eras when hope was kept alive by the strength of community bonds. Yet beneath the resilience lies a question that grows more urgent each day. As these 6 nations strengthen their alliance and signal their refusal to accept external manipulation, the world watches closely. International powers are evaluating how to respond, and regional leaders are preparing for the next phase of what could become a historic transformation. And now, as the Sahel stands at a crossroads, one critical question rises above all others. If this declaration marks the beginning of a new political era, how will the United States and the rest of the world choose to respond? Across the Atlantic, the joint declaration from the 6 African nations reached policymakers in Washington with surprising speed. Within hours, analysts from the State Department, the Pentagon, and intelligence agencies convened a series of classified meetings to assess the implications of this sudden alignment. For the United States, the Sahel is not simply a distant region. It is a strategic corridor where security, counterterrorism, trade routes, and mineral resources intersect in ways that influence global markets and diplomatic priorities. The fact that 6 nations spoke together with such firm language raised alarms. Senior officials expressed concern that the declaration could signal a shift toward reduced Western involvement at a time when extremist groups remain active and humanitarian needs continue to rise. Yet others within the administration viewed the development as a sign that African nations are seeking greater self-direction, something Washington has long said it supports. This internal divide reflects the complexity of American interests in the region and the delicate balance between supporting stability and maintaining influence. In Europe, the reactions were equally telling. Several governments issued cautious statements that expressed respect for African sovereignty, but also highlighted the importance of long-standing security partnerships. Behind the official remarks, however, diplomats privately admitted they were uncertain how to interpret the sudden unity of these 6 nations. In contrast, Russia publicly welcomed the declaration and framed it as evidence of a global shift against old power structures. China encouraged dialogue and stability, positioning itself as a neutral player ready to expand economic cooperation if the opportunity arose. The African Union remained divided, with some members calling for calm, while others expressed admiration for the bold stance taken by the Sahel Coalition. Humanitarian organizations issued their own warnings. They emphasized that geopolitical tension could complicate aid delivery, disrupt medical support, and increase the risk of migration pressures that could reach far beyond the continent. Their voices served as a reminder that political decisions made in capital cities often affect the lives of ordinary people far more quickly than anyone expects. If hearing these concerns makes you reflect on how interconnected our world has become, it is worth paying close attention to what comes next. Events unfolding in the Sahel have the potential to influence global stability in surprising ways. As analysts around the world reviewed the declaration, one question began to dominate private conversations. Was this announcement simply a diplomatic statement? Or was it the first step in a larger realignment that could challenge existing alliances on a global scale? The answer may shape the next chapter of international politics, and it may arrive sooner than anyone expects. The past 48 hours have revealed a moment in African history that may be remembered for many years to come. What began as a sudden joint declaration from 6 nations has now grown into a powerful symbol of unity at a time when global tensions are rising and geopolitical lines are being redrawn. The Sahel, a region long shaped by drought, conflict, and external pressure, now stands at the center of a new and uncertain chapter. As the international community struggles to understand the motivations behind this coordinated decision, the people of Africa are watching closely, hoping that the path ahead will lead to greater sovereignty rather than deeper conflict. For families like those of Mariama, Zalifu, and Burema. The meaning of this moment is not rooted in politics, but in the simple desire for stability and dignity. Their voices remind us that behind every diplomatic statement, there are millions of lives shaped by the choices of those in power. The warning signs are clear. If additional nations decide to join this emerging coalition, the balance of influence in Africa could shift in profound ways. Some analysts predict that new regional alliances may form within the next 90 days, while others caution that outside powers may respond with strategies that could heighten tensions even further. Such scenarios illustrate how fragile global stability can be when competing interests collide. If listening to these possibilities makes you pause and think about the world your children and grandchildren will inherit, you are not alone. It is during moments like this that reflection becomes a responsibility, and paying attention becomes an act of awareness. Your perspective, even from thousands of miles away, is part of a larger conversation about justice, self-determination, and the future of international cooperation. As the Sahel navigates this pivotal moment, many people across the region turn to faith for comfort, believing that God will guide their leaders and protect their families from the uncertainties ahead. Their prayers are shared by countless others who hope that wisdom and compassion will prevail over ambition and rivalry. May God watch over the people who wake each day wondering what tomorrow will bring, and may He grant clarity to the leaders who now stand at the crossroads of history. Yet one question rises above all others, shaping the hopes and fears of an entire continent. Is this sudden unity the beginning of an African renaissance, or the first step into a larger geopolitical storm that the world is not prepared to face?